The smell of smoke reached me before the alarms did. I remember that clearly, the way it hit the back of my throat, sharp and chemical, nothing like a campfire or a candle. I was in the elevator lobby on the 14th floor, holding my daughter's hand, waiting for my husband to come back from the meeting room where he'd left his laptop. She was 7 years old, and she'd been running a fever since the night before. I'd brought her to the office because our nanny had called in sick, and my husband had said, "Just bring her. It'll be fine. I'll be done by noon." It was 11:07 when the fire alarms started screaming. Everything happened the way it does in those situations. Fast and wrong all at once. The lights flickered. Someone in the stairwell started shouting. I pulled my daughter against my chest and she started crying immediately. That high, breathy cry she only does when she's scared and sick at the same time. And I remember pressing my lips to the top of her head and whispering, "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you," more to keep myself calm than anything else. The stairwell was packed. I took the door closest to me, the east exit. My daughter was heavy in my arms. She's always been small for her age. But that day she felt like she weighed nothing and everything at the same time, burning with fever against my collarbone. I didn't wait for my husband. I assumed he'd take the other stairwell. I assumed he'd find me outside. I assumed a lot of things that day that turned out to be wrong. We made it down 11 floors before the smoke got thick enough that people stopped and started second-guessing themselves. A man in front of me said there was a blockage, a collapsed ceiling panel on the 3rd floor landing, and that we'd need to go back up to the 7th and take the west stairs instead. My arms were shaking. My daughter had gone quiet in that way that scared me more than the crying had. Her forehead was damp. I pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck just to feel her pulse, and it was fast and light and thin, and I thought, I need to get her out of here right now. I made it back up to 7. The door to the west corridor was jammed. Swollen from the heat, I think, or warped from something, I don't know. I threw my shoulder into it twice before a man behind me managed to force it open. When I finally got out to the west stairwell, there was a structural beam that had come down at an angle across the lower half of the stairs, not blocking completely, but enough that people were having to climb over it, and it was slow, and it was unstable, and my daughter was limp against my shoulder. I twisted my ankle getting over that beam. I know now it was a moderate sprain. No fracture. The walk-in clinic confirmed it 3 days later, but in the moment it felt like the floor had come up to meet me sideways. I went down onto my knees on the concrete landing, and my daughter slid partly out of my arms, and I grabbed her before she could fall and held on. Both of us crouched on that dusty stairwell floor with smoke drifting in lazy ribbons around us. That's where I was when my husband found his way out. I know because the woman who'd been behind me on the stairs, I didn't know her name then, I know it now. It's Audrey, and she sent me a Facebook message 8 weeks later. She told me she saw him. She said he came through the main lobby exit, which was the one that opened directly onto King Street West, and he was walking with a woman from his office. His business development associate, the one he'd been working closely with for the past 14 months. He had his arm around her shoulders and he was guiding her toward the ambulance bay. And she had a bandage being pressed to a cut on her forearm, and he was talking to the paramedics. And he was not, at any point, looking for me or my daughter. I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew that when I finally made it out onto the street, my daughter in my arms, my ankle throbbing, covered in dust, eyes streaming, I couldn't find him anywhere. My daughter's temperature was 39.4 when the paramedics checked her. They got an IV line in immediately, cool fluids, and a young medic named Patrick put a cold cloth on her forehead and talked to her in a very calm, steady voice about what his dog's name was and whether she'd ever seen a golden retriever, and she answered him in a tiny, exhausted voice. And I sat on the back bumper of the ambulance with my sprained ankle dangling and called my husband's cell phone 4 times in a row with no answer. He texted me 40 minutes later, "Are you out? I've been looking everywhere. Everything okay?" I wrote back, "I'm at the ambulance bay on the east side. Where are you?" His response took 11 minutes. "Just dealing with something. I'll find you soon." He didn't find me for 2 more hours. By then, my daughter had been transported by a second ambulance to sick kids because her fever had spiked to 40.1, and they were concerned about febrile convulsions. I rode with her. I called my husband from the ambulance, and he answered on the 3rd ring this time, and I told him where we were going, and he said, Okay, I'll be there," in a voice that was distracted and slightly too quiet, like he was still in a conversation I hadn't been invited to. He showed up at Sick Kids at 4 p.m. My daughter had been admitted by then. She was on a drip, she was asleep. He walked into the room still in his work clothes, which were clean. Mine were gray with dust. My ankle was wrapped in a tensor bandage I'd borrowed from a nurse. He looked at our daughter for a long moment, and then he looked at me and he said, "She looks okay. She's stable," I said. "Good." He sat down in the chair by the window and started looking at his phone. I watched him do that for almost 30 seconds. "I called you 4 times," I said. "I know. I couldn't hear it. It was chaos out there. Where were you?" "I told you. I was dealing with something. With her." He looked up at me then, and the thing I remember most is that he didn't look guilty. He looked inconvenienced, like I was raising something that didn't deserve the energy it would take to address it. "She was in shock," he said. "She needed someone to help her." "I was in the stairwell," I said, "with our sick daughter. On my knees on a concrete floor. You got out fine. I twisted my ankle, Tanya." That was the tone he used when he thought I was being dramatic. The same tone he'd used the time I told him I felt like his family treated me like an afterthought. The same tone he'd used on our 3rd anniversary when I said I felt lonely in our marriage. She was panicking. She couldn't walk. I was the closest person to her. He stayed at the hospital for 2 hours. He went home before she woke up. I stayed the entire week. He came back each day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes less. He brought flowers once, a grocery store arrangement, plastic wrap still on, and set it on the windowsill and then sat in the chair by the window and worked on his laptop. Our daughter watched him sometimes from her bed with these very careful, very old eyes that 7-year-olds shouldn't have. She didn't ask him to sit with her. She asked me to read to her, the same 3 chapters of the same book every night. On the 5th day, he told me he had a work dinner he couldn't miss. I said, "Okay." He said, "You're not going to make this into something, no?" He nodded, satisfied, and left. I sat in the hospital room for a long time after he was gone. The machines beeped softly. My daughter was asleep. Outside the window, it was that particular kind of Toronto evening in October, where the light goes golden, and then purple very quickly, and all the office towers light up one window at a time. I thought about the stairwell. I thought about the weight of her in my arms. I thought about him walking out of that building with his arm around someone else's shoulders while I was on my knees on a concrete floor. Then I picked up my phone and called my father. My father is not a dramatic man. He's a 71-year-old retired civil engineer from Halifax, who wears the same 4 shirts on rotation and eats oatmeal every single morning. He has never raised his voice in my presence. He's not the type to swoop in. He's not the type to make pronouncements or gestures. He once fixed my car in a Canadian Tire parking lot in January rather than pay a tow truck and didn't mention it again. But when I told him what had happened, all of it, the stairwell, the ankle, the ambulance, the 4 unanswered calls, that she needed someone, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I'm flying in tomorrow morning." "Dad, you don't have to. I booked it while you were talking." I cried then. Not the panicked, breathless crying from the stairwell. Something slower and older. The kind of crying that happens when someone you love treats you like you're worth showing up for. He landed at Pearson at 7:15 a.m. He took the Up Express to Union and then a cab to the hospital, and he walked into my daughter's room with a Tim Hortons bag and 2 large double-doubles, and he sat down next to her bed and said, "Hi, Bug. I heard you've been having a rough week." And she burst into tears and grabbed his hand and he held it without saying anything else. Just let her cry, and that was when I understood completely. And for the first time that I had been doing the math wrong on what love was supposed to look like. My father stayed in Toronto. He booked a short-term furnished suite on Adelaide through an app he'd had my nephew install for him. And he didn't tell me how much it cost. And when I tried to figure it out later, I found that furnished 1-bedrooms in that neighborhood ran close to $300 a night. He'd been retired for 9 years, and this was the man who repaired his own roof. My husband didn't know my father was there yet. I hadn't mentioned it. My daughter was discharged on a Thursday. I brought her home, to our house in Leslieville. And my husband was there, in the kitchen, making pasta. And he looked genuinely pleased to see us, the way people look when something complicated has resolved itself without requiring much of them. He hugged our daughter carefully and asked if she was hungry, and she said a little, and he served her a bowl of penne with butter, and she ate about 6 bites and then fell asleep on the couch, with the TV on. He opened a bottle of wine. He poured 2 glasses. He set one in front of me like things were normal. I let him pour it. "The insurance company called," he said. "About the building. They're going to be assessing it next week." "Okay, apparently there might be a class action. Some of the other tenants are talking about it." "I know." He looked at me. "How do you know?" "I've been in contact with some of them." He didn't ask which ones. He should have asked which ones. One of them was Audrey. Audrey had sent me that Facebook message 6 days after the fire, and we'd had coffee twice by the time my daughter was discharged. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, who worked in corporate communications, and had been in the stairwell behind me the whole way down, and she had seen everything. She told me calmly and precisely, the way someone tells you something they know you need to hear, even though it costs them something to say it. She had photographs on her phone, time-stamped, from when she'd made it outside. My husband and his associate near the ambulance bay, his arm, her bandaged arm, the specific quality of care in the way he was bent toward her. Audrey also knew a lawyer. His name was Martin Cho, and he practiced family law at a firm on Bay Street, and he had an availability on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after my daughter came home. I did not tell my husband about the appointment. I went alone. I wore a blazer I'd bought 3 years ago for a job interview, and I sat across from Martin Cho, and I told him everything. And he listened without interrupting, and then he asked me a series of very specific questions about assets and property and income and pension. And by the end of the hour, he had sketched out, on a yellow legal pad, a picture of my marriage that I had never let myself look at directly. My father came with me to the second appointment. I don't know what my husband thought my father was doing in Toronto. He'd mentioned him casually once. Your dad flew in, didn't he? That's a lot for a sprained ankle. And I'd said he missed our daughter, and that had been the end of it. My husband was good at accepting surface explanations when a deeper one would inconvenience him. My father sat in the waiting area while I met with Martin Cho. Afterward, we walked to a Vietnamese place on Dundas and sat across from each other with bowls of pho. And my father said, "So what do you want to do?" "I want to leave," I said. Then we figure out how to do that properly. What properly looked like with Martin Cho's guidance was more than I'd expected. We documented everything we could document: the fire, the timeline, the hospital stay, the unanswered calls, the pattern of the past 3 years that I had to reconstruct from memory and texts and calendar entries. My father paid a paralegal retainer out of his own pocket and told me not to argue with him about it. The house in Leslieville was in both our names. The mortgage had been structured as a 50-50 split. Though for the last 2 years, my husband had been putting less in than we'd agreed, quietly, in small increments, the way people erode things when they think you're not keeping track. I had been keeping track. Not because I suspected anything, but because I am my father's daughter, and my father has always said that knowing your numbers is just basic dignity. Martin Cho found the increments interesting. There was also the matter of my husband's business expenses over the previous 14 months, which I had never looked at closely, because the business was his and I had trusted him. Martin Cho asked me very gently whether I would be comfortable requesting a financial disclosure as part of the separation process. And I said yes, and he made a note on his yellow legal pad, and that note eventually became a line of inquiry that revealed restaurant receipts and hotel stays, and flights to Montreal and Vancouver, that my husband had claimed as client entertainment, but that, on closer examination, coincided almost exactly with my associate's schedule. I won't pretend the next 4 months were easy. They weren't. They were some of the hardest months of my life, and there were nights when I put my daughter to bed, and then sat in the hallway outside her door, because I couldn't stand to be in any other room of the house. And there were mornings when I drove to the Tim Hortons on Girard, and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself go anywhere. But my father stayed. Not the entire time. He went back to Halifax twice, briefly, but he came back both times, and he called every day in between. And when the house went on the market in February and my husband went to stay at his brother's place in Vaughan, and the rooms were suddenly empty and echoey and full of boxes, my father came and stayed for a week, and we painted 2 of the rooms together, just to change the way they looked. And he did not offer opinions about my decisions, or what I should do next, or what the right way to handle any of this was. He just showed up and held the roller tray while I painted. The separation agreement was signed in late March. Martin Cho negotiated a settlement that accounted for the mortgage discrepancy, the business expenses, the fact that I had been the primary caregiver for our daughter for the entire duration of her school-age life. My husband's lawyer pushed back on the business expenses, and then stopped pushing back when Martin Cho produced the receipts in a single organized binder with color-coded tabs. I heard later, from a mutual friend, that my husband had been expecting a much easier process. I moved to a rental in East York with my daughter in April. A 2-bedroom, 2nd floor, with a backyard that the landlord said we were welcome to use. My daughter spent the first weekend arranging rocks she found near the fence into patterns on the patio. She does that. Finds systems and things, makes order out of whatever's available. She gets it from my father. On the first Sunday in May, my father drove down from Halifax in his truck. He brought a box of tools and a bookshelf he'd built in his garage over the winter for my daughter's room, and he spent the afternoon putting it together while she sat on her bed, and handed him the pieces in the right order, because she'd already figured out the instructions. They worked in near silence, The two of them. Just the sound of the drill and her occasional matter-of-fact "this piece next, Grandpa." I stood in the doorway and watched them and thought, this is what I want her to know. Not the fire, not the stairwell, not what her father chose in the moment where it counted. This. My husband and I have a co-parenting arrangement that is civil, because Martin Cho built it carefully, and because I've decided that civil is the floor, not the ceiling, and I'll live above it regardless of what he does. My daughter sees him every second weekend and one Wednesday evening per week. She is doing well at school. She has opinions about everything. She told me last month that she wants to be a structural engineer when she grows up, which made my father laugh harder than I've heard him laugh in years. I am 38 years old, and I own very little right now, and I am starting almost completely from scratch, and I am the least afraid I have ever been in my life. There is something that happens to you when you survive a stairwell full of smoke with a sick child in your arms. Something recalibrates. The question you stop asking is, how did I get here? And the question you start asking is, what do I actually need? And it turns out the answer is simpler and smaller and more specific than the life I had been living. I need my daughter to feel safe. I need my father to be able to call me and hear in my voice that I'm okay. I need a backyard where she can arrange rocks into patterns, and I can drink coffee and watch her do it, and not feel the particular low-grade dread I had stopped noticing because it had been there so long. I need to know that when something collapses around me, I will be the one who gets us out. I already knew that. It just took a stairwell to remind me.